The scent of roasted boar and spiced wine was a thick, cloying blanket in the great hall, but it could not smother the sharper, uglier smells. Underneath the forced merriment, Seraphina smelled fear. It clung to the courtiers like cheap perfume, a brittle anxiety that rose from their skin with every strained laugh. She also smelled ambition, a coppery, blood-like tang that emanated from the alpha's posturing near the head table. But worst of all was the contempt, a sour, vinegary odor directed squarely at her. Seraphina kept her head bowed, her useless eyes fixed on the gnarled grain of the trestle table before her. Blind since birth, she had long ago learned to navigate her world through sound and scent and the subtle shifts in the air. Tonight, the air was heavy with malice. She sat at the very end of the lowest table, a deliberate placement by her stepmother, Lady Isolde. It was a seat of shame, meant for the lowest of omegas, the wolfless, the broken. She was all three. Her fingers, long and pale, traced the rim of her untouched wooden goblet. She could hear everything: the rustle of silks from a lady 2 tables away, the nervous tap of a beta's boot against the stone floor, the frantic, rabbit-like thump of a young pup's heart as he watched the guards by the door. And she could hear her stepmother's voice, dripping with false sweetness as she entertained the alpha of a neighboring pack. "My Bryony, of course, is the pride of our pack," Lady Isolde said, her voice a carefully constructed melody of pride. But beneath it, Seraphina heard the discordant notes of calculation. Her shift was one of the strongest we have seen in a generation. A true alpha female. Seraphina's stepsister Bryony was indeed everything their society valued. She was beautiful, with a wolf form as golden and fierce as the sun. She was strong, her scent a confident blend of pine and power. She sat near her mother, a jewel on display, accepting the compliments with practiced grace. Seraphina felt no jealousy, only a hollow ache for the sisterly affection they had never shared. "And your other daughter?" The visiting alpha, a gruff man named Fenris, rumbled. His voice was a low growl full of gravel and suspicion. He was testing Isolde. A delicate, cruel laugh escaped her stepmother's lips. It sounded like shattering glass. "Oh, you mean Seraphina?" She said the name as if it were a curse. "She is a sad affair, an omega, wolfless, and, well..." Isolde let the word hang in the air, a poisoned dart. Seraphina felt the eyes of those nearby turn to her, felt their pity and disgust wash over her in a suffocating wave. "The blind one," Fenris finished, his voice devoid of sympathy. "A bad omen." "We are charitable," Isolde purred, the lie a sour note in her song. "We allow her a place at the feast. It is the least we can do for her poor father's memory." The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on Seraphina's shoulders. Her father had been a good man, a strong beta who had loved her mother fiercely. After her mother's death in childbirth, he had remarried Isolde out of a desperate need for a mother for his daughters. It was a mistake that had cost him his life, a convenient hunting accident that had left Isolde in control of the pack's wealth and standing, and it had left Seraphina at her mercy. Her only defense, her only secret, was the clarity of her hearing. It was more than just acute. It was a strange, almost magical sense. She could hear the truth in a person's heart. A lie was a subtle tremor in the rhythm of a heartbeat, a discordant hum beneath the spoken word. Fear was a frantic, off-key patter. Love, a sensation she had only ever heard from her father, was a deep, resonant hum, a perfect harmony of blood and breath. Isolde's heart was a tight, clipped staccato, full of selfish, sharp-edged notes. Suddenly, a hush fell over the great hall. It was so abrupt that the silence itself was a sound, a vast, echoing void. The nervous tapping stopped. The laughter died. Even the crackling of the hearth seemed to hold its breath. Seraphina lifted her head, her nostrils flaring. A new scent had entered the hall, one that eclipsed all others. It smelled of winter storms, of ancient forests and cold, hard iron. It was a scent of absolute power, so potent it made the air crackle. A single set of footsteps echoed on the stone dais. They were heavy, measured, and utterly without hesitation. The sound of them vibrated through the floorboards, up the legs of her bench, and into her very bones. The heartbeats in the room had all changed. The frantic patter of fear had intensified, becoming a panicked symphony of terror. Even the arrogant alphas had their pulses thrumming with a new, unwelcome rhythm: submission. The Alpha King. Someone whispered near her, the words trembling. King Alaric. A name spoken only in hushed, fearful tones. He was a recluse, a phantom who ruled the United Pax from his desolate fortress in the north. He had not attended a tribute feast in a decade. His reputation was that of a monster, a king whose cruelty was matched only by his power. They said he was scarred, disfigured, that his rage could level mountains. They said he was cursed. Serafina listened, not to the whispers, but to the man himself. His scent was overwhelming, but his sound was unexpected. There was no sound. From the dais where he now stood, there was no audible heartbeat. It was impossible. Every living wolf had a heartbeat, a rhythm that told the story of their soul. But from the Alpha King, there was only a profound, unnerving silence, as if a black hole had opened in the center of the hall, swallowing all life and sound. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever encountered. "The tributes!" a voice boomed, that of the king's beta, a man whose heart beat with the steady, loyal rhythm of a war drum. One by one, the alphas of the vassal packs approached the dais, offering gifts: gold, weapons, prize hunters. Lady Isolde rose, her movements fluid and confident. Serafina heard the rustle of her silk gown and the sharp, dissonant clang of her own heart in her ears. "Majesty," Isolde began, her voice a perfect instrument of deference, "Blackwood Pack offers you our greatest treasure. My daughter, Bryony, a true alpha, strong and fertile, to serve the throne as you see fit." A murmur of approval went through the hall. It was a fine offering, a strategic one. Bryony was a prize. Serafina braced herself for the king's dismissal. He was known to refuse all such offerings of companionship. But the king did not speak. The oppressive silence from the dais stretched on, thin and sharp. Then his voice came, and it was not the roar of a monster she had expected. It was low and cold, like the scrape of stone on ice. "I see your offering." There was a pause. Serafina could hear Isolde's heartbeat quicken with uncertainty. She had expected a swift refusal, which she could spin into a tale of her daughter's virtue being too pure even for a king. She had not expected this consideration. Then the king's cold gaze must have swept the hall, for the fear intensified. His voice came again, closer this time, as if he had moved. "You offer me your greatest treasure, but you have another daughter, do you not?" Isolde's breath hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible sound, but to Serafina it was a thunderclap of panic. "Majesty? She is nothing, a disgrace." "She is your daughter," the king stated. It was not a question. The icy voice was now directed towards the end of the hall, towards her. "The one you hide in the shadows. The broken one." Every head turned. Serafina felt the weight of their stares like a physical blow. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the floor, but her spine stiffened with a flicker of defiance she did not know she possessed. She would not give her stepmother the satisfaction of seeing her cower. "Bring her to me," the king commanded. The words were not loud, but they carried the weight of an avalanche. 2 guards gripped Serafina's arms. Their touch was rough, their hearts hammering with fear of the man they served. They hauled her from the bench and dragged her towards the dais, her bare feet stumbling on the cold stone. The journey felt 1,000 miles long, a walk through a tunnel of hostile silence and the overwhelming stormy scent of the king. She was forced to her knees before the throne. The cold from the stone seeped into her thin dress. She kept her head bowed, her curtain of pale, silvery hair hiding her face. "Look at me," he commanded. "I cannot, my lord," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "I am blind." The silence that followed was different. It was laced with something new. Not cruelty, not indifference. It was curiosity. She heard the faint rustle of heavy cloth as he leaned forward. A large hand, calloused and impossibly warm, cupped her chin. His touch was surprisingly gentle as he tilted her face upward. She flinched, expecting a blow, a sneer. Instead, his thumb brushed softly against her cheekbone. And in that moment of contact, something extraordinary happened. For the first time, she heard it. Faint, deep, and slow, like the tolling of a great bell at the bottom of the ocean. A heartbeat. His heartbeat. It was damaged, a fractured, discordant rhythm, but it was there, and it was only there when he was touching her. "Your alpha offers her sister, a perfect specimen." The king's cold voice washed over her, yet the sound of his heart told a different story, one of ancient pain and a flicker of disbelief. "And in an act of supreme insult, your lady mother offers you, a broken omega." He paused, his thumb still tracing a line on her skin. "I find myself insulted. Not by the offering of the broken one, but by the assumption that I would prefer the hollow perfection of the other." He released her chin, and the sound of his heart vanished back into the void. The warmth of his touch lingered on her skin like a brand. "I reject the alpha female," King Alaric declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority through the stunned hall. "The tribute is accepted. The blind one is now mine." The journey to the king's northern fortress, the Dreadfort, was a blur of cold winds and the rhythmic plodding of horses. Seraphina rode in an enclosed carriage, a prisoner bound for a cage of stone and ice. The guards spoke little, their fear of their king a palpable wall around them. She spent the days wrapped in a thick fur blanket, listening to the world outside. The cry of a hawk, the rush of a river, the whisper of wind through pines. She was terrified, yet a strange calm had settled deep within her. For the first time in her life, she was free of Lady Isolde's suffocating presence. Whatever horrors awaited her in the Dreadfort, they would be new horrors. The fortress was exactly as its reputation suggested. When the carriage finally halted and the door was opened, a blast of frigid air assaulted her. The scent was of cold stone, ancient ice, and a profound underlying loneliness that seemed to have soaked into the very walls. The sounds were muted, swallowed by immense echoing halls. There were no courtiers laughing, no servants gossiping. There was only the sound of the wind howling outside and the heavy, solitary footsteps of guards. She was led by a firm but not unkind hand, a woman whose heartbeat was steady and professional. An attendant, perhaps. They ascended endless flights of stairs, the air growing colder with each step. Finally, they stopped before a massive set of iron-bound doors. "The king's wing," the woman said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You will remain here. Food will be brought. Do not wander." The doors groaned open, and Seraphina was gently pushed inside. They closed behind her with a boom that echoed in her bones, followed by the heavy, final sound of a bolt being shot. She was a prisoner. She stood still, taking in her new prison. It was vast. The air was still and cold, but a large fire crackled in a hearth somewhere to her left. Its warmth a welcome caress on her skin. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the faint, lingering aroma of the king, that storm and forest scent that made her shiver. She took a tentative step forward, her hands outstretched, and her fingers brushed against the soft velvet of a high-backed chair. She moved slowly, mapping the room with her senses. A large table, a shelf filled with leather-bound books, a fur-draped bed so large it felt like a snowdrift. It was a space built for a giant, for a man who needed room for his solitude. For 2 days she saw no one but the silent attendant who brought her meals. She spent the time exploring her gilded cage, running her hands over intricate tapestries that depicted ancient battles, breathing in the scent of beeswax from the candles that were always lit. She found a small balcony and stood in the biting wind, listening to the desolate beauty of the north. It was a lonely existence, but it was peaceful. She was no longer a spectacle of shame. Here, in the king's private prison, she was simply invisible. On the evening of the 3rd day, the doors opened without warning. The king's scent filled the room before he even spoke, a wave of cold power that made the flames in the hearth dance. "You are quiet," Alaric said. His voice was the same icy drawl, but in the confines of his own space it seemed less a weapon and more a shield. Seraphina turned from the fire, dipping into a respectful curtsy. "I have no one to speak to, my lord." She heard him move across the room, his heavy boots silent on the thick furs covering the floor. He stopped only a few feet from her. The unnatural silence where his heart should be was a palpable presence between them. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked. It was a genuine question. The undercurrents in his voice held no threat, only a stark, barren curiosity. "I fear your power, my lord," she answered honestly. "I do not know enough of the man to fear him." A soft sound, almost a huff of amusement, escaped him. "The man is the power. They are inseparable." "I do not believe that is true," she said softly. He moved closer still. She felt the air displace around her, felt the sheer size of him. And what would a blind Omega know of such things? The words were harsh, but his tone lacked true venom. It was the practiced cruelty of a man used to keeping others at a distance. "I may be blind, but I can hear," she countered, a spark of defiance lighting within her. "I hear the fear in every person in this castle. I hear it in the guards outside this door. Their hearts beat like trapped birds whenever you are near. But I hear other things too. I hear the loyalty in your beta's voice. And in yours." She trailed off, hesitant. "What?" he pressed, his voice sharp. "What do you hear in mine?" "I hear a man who has built walls of silence so high he can no longer hear his own heart." The silence that followed was absolute. She feared she had gone too far, that she had pricked the beast's pride. She braced herself for his rage. Instead, a gloved hand reached out and touched her arm. The leather was cold, but through it, she felt the same impossible warmth she'd felt at the feast. And with the touch came the sound. That deep, broken tolling of his heart. It was slower this time, less fractured. "Tell me what you hear now," he commanded, his voice a low whisper. She closed her eyes, though it made no difference, and focused. "It is there," she breathed, a sense of wonder in her voice. "It is wounded. Like a beautiful bell with a crack in it. It rings, but the tone is full of pain." His hand tightened on her arm, not with anger, but with something she couldn't name. Shock? Disbelief? "No one has ever—" "How can you hear it?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I have always been able to hear the truth in people. Their heartbeats tell stories. Yours is silent until you touch me." He snatched his hand back as if burned, and the sound vanished instantly. The void returned, colder and more profound than before. "You will not speak of this to anyone," he snarled, the shield of his cruelty slamming back into place. "You are my property. A tribute. You will remain here, in silence, until I find a use for you. Do you understand?" "Yes, my lord," she whispered, her defiance crumbling under the sudden frost in his voice. He turned and strode from the room, the doors slamming shut behind him, leaving her alone with the crackling fire and the echo of a broken heartbeat. She now understood part of his secret. He was not heartless, but his heart was somehow hidden, locked away. And for some inexplicable reason, her touch was the key. This knowledge was a dangerous, terrifying thing. It made her more than just a prisoner. It made her a threat to the king's solitude and a potential cure for a wound he had clearly carried for a very long time. Days bled into weeks. A strange routine formed in the silent wing of the Dreadfort. Alaric would visit her chambers each evening. He never stayed long, and their conversations were stilted, cautious. He would ask her questions about her life, her blindness, her strange hearing. He spoke like a scholar studying a peculiar specimen, detached and clinical. But Serafina heard the truth beneath the questions. She heard a desperate, aching loneliness, a curiosity he tried to mask with disdain. He never touched her. He kept his distance, always wearing his thick leather gloves, a physical barrier to match the emotional one he maintained so fiercely. But she knew he was testing himself, drawing near the one thing that seemed to breach his defenses, trying to understand it. One evening, he found her humming by the fire, a simple, sad melody her mother used to sing. He stopped just inside the doorway, and for a long time, he just listened. "What is that song?" he finally asked, his voice softer than usual. "It was my mother's," Serafina replied, her hands falling still in her lap. "She sang it to me when I was a child. It's sorrowful. It's a song about a star that fell in love with the moon," she explained. The star burned so brightly to be noticed, it consumed itself and faded away, never knowing the moon had loved its light all along. Alaric moved to the hearth, standing over her, a towering shadow against the firelight. "A foolish star." "Or a hopeful one," she countered gently. "Perhaps it is better to burn out for love than to fade away in darkness." He did not reply. Instead, he sank into the large chair opposite her, a rare sign of him letting his guard down. The silence stretched, but it was comfortable, warmed by the fire and the sad old song. In these moments, he was not the monster king, and she was not the broken tribute. They were just two lonely souls sharing a pocket of quiet in a loud, cruel world. This fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a delegation from the south. The king's beta, Gareth, a man whose presence was as solid and dependable as the fortress walls, brought the news to Alaric in his study. Serafina, who had been brought to the study to mend one of the king's torn cloaks, her nimble fingers and sensitivity to texture making her an excellent seamstress, sat quietly in a corner, listening. "It's Lord Morcant, Your Majesty," Gareth announced, his heartbeat a steady drum of concern. "He and his retinue have arrived, claiming they come to discuss the border disputes." "Morcant is a snake," Alaric growled, the sound a low vibration of contempt. "He wouldn't travel this far north for a border dispute. What does he truly want?" "He brought his daughter with him," Gareth said, and Serafina heard the subtle dip in his heart's rhythm that signified bad news. "And he is petitioning the council, reminding them that you are without a Luna, without an heir." Serafina's needle stilled. She knew of Lord Morcant. He was ambitious and cruel, a man who saw power as a birthright. And he was a distant cousin to Lady Isolde. The connection was a cold knot in her stomach. "He means to force a marriage alliance," Alaric stated, his voice flat and cold. "He thinks he can use my seclusion against me." "He is stirring up the old rumors, my king," Gareth warned, the whispers about the curse. "He suggests a strong, healthy Luna from a powerful pack would stabilize the throne." He suggests my throne is unstable? The king's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with his silent fury. He is careful with his words, but his meaning is clear, Gareth confirmed. Seraphina bent her head back over her sewing, trying to make herself smaller, to fade into the tapestries. But she could feel the king's attention shift to her. He had not forgotten she was there. Leave us, Alaric commanded his beta. Gareth hesitated, his concern for his king warring with his duty to obey. My lord. Leave us. Gareth bowed and retreated, the heavy study doors closing behind him. The room was left in a tense silence, broken only by the scratch of the king's quill as he pretended to review a document. But Seraphina could hear the truth. His hand was not moving. He was staring at her. You are from the south, he said finally. You know these vipers. I know of Lord Morcant, she said, her voice barely a whisper. His pack values strength and purity of bloodline above all else. They are traditionalists. They are fanatics, he corrected her harshly. They believe any perceived weakness should be purged. They would see someone like you left on a mountain for the wolves. The cruelty of his words was a slap, but she knew he was not aiming it at her. He was speaking of himself. He saw himself as weak, as something to be purged. This is my fault, she murmured, a terrible realization dawning on her. My stepmother, she must have sent word to him. She offered me as a tribute, expecting you to kill me. When you did not, you showed interest, an attachment. You showed a perceived weakness. She is using me to hurt you. Alaric slammed his fist on the desk. The sound made her jump, and a stack of parchments fluttered to the floor. You are not to blame for the ambitions of jackals. His rage was a palpable force, but for the first time, she sensed it was not directed at her, but for her. He was angry on her behalf. He rose from his desk and paced the room, a caged lion. They will demand to see you. Morcant will want to assess the broken tribute that has captured his king's attention. He will see your blindness, your omega status. He will use it as proof of my unfitness to rule. Then hide me, she pleaded. Keep me in the chambers. They will never have to know I am here. No, he said, his voice resolute. He stopped pacing and stood before her. I have hidden in the shadows long enough. I will not hide you too. You are under my protection. You will attend the evening meal. You will sit at my table. Her blood ran cold. My lord, no. They will mock me. They will use me to shame you. He knelt before her, a shocking gesture from a king. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out and for the first time since that night in the great hall, his gloved fingers touched her, gripping her hands where they lay clasped in her lap. The sound of his heart returned, a frantic, chaotic thunder. It was louder than before, amplified by his rage and his fear. But it was there. It was real. Let them try, he growled, his voice a low promise. Let them see what happens when they try to shame what belongs to the Alpha King. His touch, his proximity, the violent but protective beat of his hidden heart, it sent a tremor of something entirely new through her. It was not fear. It was a dizzying, terrifying thrill. He was not hiding her to protect himself. He was putting her on display to protect her. In his own brutal way, he was choosing to stand with her against the world. And Seraphina knew, with a certainty that shook her to her core, that the fragile peace of her imprisonment was over. The war for the king's throne and his soul had just begun. The dining hall of the Dreadfort was a cavernous space, designed to intimidate. Tonight, it was filled with the unwelcome warmth and noise of Lord Morcant's retinue. Their laughter was too loud, their scents too aggressive, a blatant challenge to the austere sovereignty of the North. Seraphina walked at Alaric's side, her hand resting hesitantly on his forearm. His muscles were tense beneath the fine wool of his tunic, coiled springs of restrained violence. He wore no gloves. His bare hand rested over hers, a possessive, searing weight. The broken bell of his heart hammered a chaotic rhythm against her ribs, a wild counterpoint to the steady, arrogant pulses of Morkant's pack. Every step she took was an act of faith, her trust placed entirely in the man leading her through a sea of unseen enemies. The whispers started immediately, a hiss of venom that slithered through the hall. "The blind Omega? Is that the tribute? He keeps such a damaged thing. He shames himself. He shames us all." Alaric gave no sign he heard them, but the heat of his hand intensified. He led her to the head table on the dais and seated her not just near him, but in the chair reserved for the Luna. The gasp that swept the hall was a cold wind. It was a deliberate, outrageous statement. Lord Morkant sat to Alaric's right, a large, imposing man whose heart beat with a slow, arrogant thud of absolute self-assurance. His scent was of stale earth and ambition. "Your Majesty," Morkant began, his voice a rich baritone coated in false deference, "you honor us with your hospitality. And you surprise us. We had not heard you had chosen a companion." His gaze, she knew, was fixed on her, dissecting her, judging her. "I have not chosen a companion," Alaric replied, his voice freezing the air. "I have claimed what is mine." "There is a difference." He squeezed her hand, a silent message of reassurance. The simple contact sent a jolt through her, and she could hear the frantic rhythm of his heart steady slightly, finding a less chaotic beat in her presence. It was as if she were an anchor in his internal storm. The meal was an ordeal. Morkant and his followers directed thinly veiled insults at her, commenting on the importance of keen eyes for a Luna, of strong blood for an heir, of a flawless wolf form to lead the pack. Seraphina remained silent, her head held high, focusing on the sound of Alaric's heart, drawing strength from its wounded but defiant rhythm. Finally, Morkant's daughter, a haughty alpha female named Cressida, spoke directly to Seraphina. Her voice was sharp and cruel, just like her father's. "It must be so difficult for you, little Omega, to live in darkness, to be of no use. Tell me, what can you possibly offer a king?" Before Seraphina could even think of a reply, Alaric's hand tightened on hers until it was almost painful. "She offers me peace," he snarled, his voice dangerously low. "A commodity your kind knows nothing about." He stood abruptly, the legs of his throne scraping against the stone. The movement was so sudden, so violent, that the entire hall fell silent. He pulled Seraphina to her feet beside him. "This tribute is complete," he announced, his voice booming with royal command. "Lord Morkant, you have your answer. My throne is not vacant. My pack has its Luna." He turned, pulling her with him, and strode from the hall without a backward glance. The shock and outrage he left in his wake were a palpable force. He did not stop until they were back in the sanctuary of his private chambers. He released her hand as the doors closed, and the sound of his heart vanished. He paced the room, the caged lion once more, his fury a living thing in the air. "How dare he?" he raged, his voice a low growl. "How dare they come into my home and question my rule, my choice?" "You should not have done that," Seraphina whispered, her body trembling from the confrontation. "You should not have called me Luna. You have given them the weapon they need." "I gave them nothing," he roared, whirling to face her. "I showed them that this king does not bow to their petty traditions and their obsession with perfection. They think you are weak, and you have just shown them a weakness they can name." "Me!" she cried, her own fear and frustration finally boiling over. "They will not stop until they have torn me down to get to you." He crossed the room in 2 long strides and gripped her shoulders, his bare hands searing her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. Then let them try. Do you think I am afraid of a dog like Morcant? With his touch, his heartbeat roared back to life in her ears, a maelstrom of fury, fear, and something else. Something deeper and more painful. And in that moment, she saw not with her eyes but with her other senses. She felt the truth of him, the secret he guarded more fiercely than his kingdom. His curse was not just the silence of his heart, it was something physical, something that caused him agony. Your hands, she breathed, her own hands coming up to cover his. They are burning. He flinched, trying to pull away, but she held fast. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice strained. I can feel it, she insisted, her senses overwhelmed. It wasn't a literal heat, but a wave of energy, of pain, that pulsed from his skin. It is like a fire. A cold fire. It is what silences your heart. It is what causes the pain. He froze, his entire body rigid with shock. He stared down at her, and though she could not see his face, she could feel the utter astonishment, the raw vulnerability in his posture. No one had ever known. No one had ever gotten close enough to feel it. Slowly, he pulled one hand from her shoulder. He hesitated, his whole body trembling with an emotion she couldn't decipher. Then, with infinite reluctance, he began to unbutton the cuff of his tunic. He took her hand and pressed her palm against his bare wrist. The shock was so intense it stole her breath. His skin was not smooth. It was a landscape of jagged, raised scars, the flesh twisted and marred. But worse than the texture was the energy that poured from it. It was a wave of pure agony, a living curse that felt like creeping ice and burning shadow. It writhed under his skin, a malevolent presence. And as she touched it, she felt the discordance in his heartbeat intensify into a screech of torment. This, he said, his voice ragged with a pain he had hidden for years, is the curse of the Alpha King. A shadow that eats me alive. It makes touch an agony, any touch, except yours. She gasped, understanding crashing down on her. His cruelty, his isolation, his gloves. It was all a defense against a world of unbearable pain. Other people's touch must have amplified the curse, but hers soothed it. Her hand, resting on the cursed flesh, did not recoil. Instead, an instinct she didn't know she possessed rose up in her. She focused not on the pain, but on the man beneath it. She poured all her will, all her strange empathy into her touch. She felt the writhing shadows calm. She heard the screeching discord in his heart lessen, the frantic rhythm slowing to a less painful beat. Alaric let out a shuddering breath, his head falling forward until his forehead rested against hers. The tension in his massive frame seemed to drain away, leaving him trembling in her grasp. How? He whispered, his voice broken. How do you do that? I don't know, she confessed, tears welling in her blind eyes. I just hear you. All of you. In that moment, the power dynamic between them shattered and reformed. He was not the all-powerful king, and she was not the broken tribute. He was a man in agony, and she was the only relief he had ever known. This revelation was more binding than any royal decree, more intimate than any kiss, and it sealed their fates together, for better or for worse. Morcant and his plots no longer seemed like the greatest threat. The true battle was against the shadows clinging to the king's own skin, and Seraphina was now standing on the front lines. The king's confession changed everything. The space between them, once filled with caution and unspoken rules, now hummed with a fragile, terrifying intimacy. Alaric no longer kept his distance. He sought her out, not just in the evenings, but throughout the day. He would sit in silence while she worked on her mending, his bare hand resting on the arm of her chair. He did not speak of the curse again, but the constant grounding presence of his touch, and the steadying, wounded beat of his heart it allowed her to hear, spoke volumes. For Seraphina, the world of the Dreadfort began to open up. Guided by Alaric's hand, she learned the layout of the castle's main floors. He described the grim, beautiful tapestries to her, his voice, usually so cold, taking on a softer timbre as he spoke of his ancestors. He led her through the snow-dusted gardens, where the only sound was the crunch of their boots and the whisper of the wind through skeletal branches. He was showing her his world, letting her into his solitude. One afternoon, he led her to the castle library, a place she had only sensed from the scent of old paper and leather. He pulled a heavy tome from a shelf. "My ancestor, the first king of the North, wrote this," he said, his voice low. "It speaks of the curse." He placed her hand on the open page. The parchment was brittle with age. He made a pact with a shadow entity for the power to unite the Pax and end a bloody civil war. The power was granted, but it came with a price. The shadow became a part of our bloodline, a torment passed from father to son. It grants us immense strength, but it feeds on our connection to others. It twists affection into pain, making touch unbearable, ensuring the king is always isolated, always alone. "It is why you were drawn to me," she realized aloud. "Because I am blind." "You thought I could not see the curse on your skin." "Partly," he admitted, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. The sound of his heart was a slow, deep thrum, the calmest she had ever heard it. "But it was more than that. The moment you stood before me at the feast, the curse in me quieted. It recoiled from you. I did not understand why. I still don't." "It fears the light," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she meant. "Perhaps it fears what it cannot understand." Their bond deepened in the quiet moments, a silent language of touch and trust. But outside the king's wing, the storm was gathering. Lord Morcant was not idle. He spread his poison through the court, using Alaric's public declaration of Seraphina as his Luna, as the proof of his madness. A blind, wolfless Omega on the throne? It was an aberration, an insult to their traditions. It was a sign that the king's curse had finally broken his mind. Gareth brought the grim news. "He has convinced half the council, my lord. They are calling for a formal challenge to your rule. They demand you set her aside and take a proper Luna, or they will move to have you deposed." Alaric's fury was a cold, sharp thing. He stood before the fire, Seraphina's hand held tightly in his. "They are fools. They mistake compassion for weakness." "They are scared, Alaric," Gareth said, using his king's name in a rare display of familiarity. "They see you breaking with centuries of tradition. They see a woman who, by all their laws, is worthless. They cannot understand it, and Morcant is using that fear." "Then we will make them understand," Alaric said, his voice hard as iron. He turned to Seraphina, his grip on her hand gentle but firm. "He wants a public spectacle? He will have one. We will hold a bonding ceremony, in the old ways, in the sight of the full moon and the entire court. I will mark you as mine, as my Luna, and any who challenge it will face my wrath." Seraphina's heart leaped into her throat. A bonding ceremony was sacred, permanent. It would tie their life forces together. It was the ultimate declaration. It was also an incredible risk. It would force the issue, drawing a line in the snow that Morcant and his allies would be forced to cross. "They will try to stop it," she breathed. "They may try to harm you. Or me." "Let them," Alaric repeated his familiar, defiant mantra. But this time it sounded different. It was not just the growl of a wounded animal. It was the roar of a king ready to fight for his queen. The night of the full moon was bitingly cold. The ceremony was to be held in the castle's ancient central courtyard, open to the sky. The entire court was assembled, their hostility a palpable miasma in the frigid air. Seraphina stood on a raised platform beside Alaric, clad in a simple white gown that did little to ward off the chill. But Alaric's hand was a furnace in hers, and the steady, powerful beat of his heart, now so familiar to her, was a war drum giving her courage. Lord Morcant stood at the forefront of the assembled lords, his face a mask of contemptuous disbelief. As the moon reached its zenith, casting a silvery glow over the snow, Alaric raised their joined hands. "I stand before you tonight to claim my Luna!" His voice boomed, echoing off the stone walls. "Seraphina of Blackwood Pack, she is my choice. She is the heart of my kingdom." "She is a blight," Morcant roared, stepping forward. "A wolfless, blind Omega. She is a symptom of the sickness in your blood, Alaric. You are unfit. Your curse has made you weak. I, Lord Morcant, invoke the right of challenge." A collective gasp went through the crowd. A formal challenge to the throne during a bonding ceremony was unheard of. It was the highest treason. Alaric released Seraphina's hand, and the loss of his touch, the sudden silence of his heart, was a physical blow. He stepped forward, placing himself between her and Morcant. "You dare?" Alaric's voice was deceptively soft, yet it carried more menace than any shout. "I dare." Morcant drew his sword, its polished steel gleaming in the moonlight. Several of his allied lords did the same, creating a wall of hostile steel. "Depose the cursed king!" For the good of the Pax. But before the first challenger could take a step, a new sound cut through the tension. A low, guttural growl that did not come from Alaric's throat. It came from the shadows behind the platform. Seraphina's head whipped around, her senses on high alert. Gareth and the loyal royal guards moved to form a protective circle, but they were too slow. Assassins, clad in black, melted from the shadows, daggers drawn. They were not aiming for the king, they were aiming for her. It was a trap. The challenge was a distraction. Morcant's true plan was to eliminate the perceived source of the king's weakness. "Seraphina!" Alaric roared, his head turning in panic. He was too far away, bogged down by Morcant and his men. A black-clad figure lunged at her. She stumbled back, her hands flying up in a useless gesture of defense. She heard the whisper of the blade cutting through the air, felt the cold rush of death. Then an explosion of power threw her from her feet. It was not a sound or a light, but a wave of pure, unadulterated rage that emanated from Alaric. A guttural scream of absolute fury tore from his throat, a sound that was not entirely human. She landed hard on the stones, her head striking the ground. Dazed, she pushed herself up. The courtyard had erupted into chaos. The sense of blood and raw, terrifying magic filled the air. And she heard it. The curse. The shadow. It had been unleashed. The steady, wounded beat of Alaric's heart was gone, replaced by a terrifying, chaotic cacophony. From the center of the courtyard came the sounds of screaming, of tearing flesh, of breaking bone. Alaric had given himself over to the shadow to protect her. He had sacrificed his control, his very soul, and in doing so, had just shown the entire world the monster that lived beneath his skin. He had saved her life, but he may have just damned them both. Chaos reigned in the courtyard. The air was thick with the stench of blood and a chilling, otherworldly cold that had nothing to do with the winter night. Seraphina, pushing herself to her knees, could hear the screams of Morcant's men, sharp cries of terror and agony that were abruptly cut short. Over it all was a sound that would haunt her forever, a low, continuous snarl of pure rage, a sound born of shadow and ancient pain. It was Alaric's voice, yet not his voice. It was the curse given form. Gareth was suddenly at her side, his strong hand gripping her arm. "My lady, we must get you inside." His heartbeat was a frantic drum of fear, not for himself, but for his king. "No!" she cried, trying to pull away. "Alaric! I have to get to him." "You can't," Gareth insisted, his voice strained as he hauled her towards the relative safety of a doorway. "No one can get near him when he's like this. The shadow has taken hold. He won't know you." But Seraphina knew he was wrong. She could still feel their connection, a thin, frayed thread in the storm of his fury. He had done this for her. She would not abandon him to the darkness he had embraced to save her. Wrenching her arm from Gareth's grasp, she stumbled back towards the center of the maelstrom. "Alaric!" she screamed, her voice raw. The sounds of slaughter ceased. An unnatural silence fell over the courtyard, broken only by the ragged, panting breaths of the creature that had once been her king. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, her bare feet sticking to the blood-slicked stones. The cold intensified, seeping into her bones. "My lord?" she whispered into the oppressive quiet. A low growl answered her. It was close. She reached out a trembling hand into the darkness. Her fingers brushed against something that was not cloth or skin. It was cold, hard, and seemed to drink the warmth from her touch. It felt like living, solidified shadow. She heard a sharp intake of breath, a painful, rasping sound. She had touched him. She had touched the curse itself. "Seraphina." His voice was a mangled wreck, a battle between the man and the monster. "Get back. I can't control it." Instead of retreating, she took another step forward, placing her full palm against the shifting, shadowy mass that she knew was his arm. A wave of agony, his agony, washed over her, so intense it made her knees buckle. But she did not pull away. She held on, anchoring herself to him. "I am not leaving you," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She focused past the cold, past the pain, past the terrifying power radiating from him. She listened for the faint, almost imperceptible echo of the man she knew. She searched for the broken bell of his heart, buried deep beneath the roaring tempest of the curse. And she found it. A tiny, flickering beat, a desperate pulse of light in an overwhelming darkness. "I hear you, Alaric," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can still hear you. Fight it." She pressed her other hand against him, channeling every ounce of her will, her empathy, her love. It was a word she had not dared to think, but in this moment of life and death, it was the only truth that mattered. She loved this broken, tormented king. She felt the shadows writhe under her touch, resisting her, trying to throw her off. But the small, flickering heartbeat began to grow stronger, steadier. The chaotic noise of the curse began to recede, the discordant notes resolving into something less monstrous. Alaric let out a great, shuddering cry, and the immense pressure in the courtyard vanished. The unnatural cold dissipated. He collapsed, a dead weight against her, pulling her down to the ground with him. He was just a man again, trembling and spent. His bare skin, no longer covered in shadow, was slick with sweat despite the cold. She held him, her arms wrapped around his broad, shaking shoulders as he gasped for air on the bloody stones of his courtyard. His heart was beating, not the faint echo she had to strain to hear, but a real, solid, thunderous rhythm against her chest. It was still broken, still full of pain, but it was loud, it was free. The curse's hold had been shattered, if only for a moment. Gareth and the loyal guards surrounded them, their relief a palpable wave. Lord Morcant was dead, his body twisted and broken nearby. His surviving conspirators were on their knees, disarmed and shaking in terror, their arrogance replaced by primal fear of the power they had witnessed. The coup was over, but the victory felt hollow. Alaric had revealed his deepest, darkest secret. He had shown the world his monster. "It is done," Gareth said grimly, standing over them. "The traitors are dealt with." Alaric pushed himself up slowly, his body aching. He looked not at the carnage, but at Seraphina. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a smear of dirt. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice raw. "No," she whispered, leaning into his touch. "Thanks to you." The remaining lords and ladies of the court stared at them, their faces a mixture of horror and awe. They had seen their king become a monster, and then they had seen the blind Omega tame him with a touch. Alaric got to his feet, pulling Seraphina up with him. He stood before the shocked assembly, his arms securely around her waist, a king reclaiming his authority. "You have all seen the curse I bear," he said, his voice ringing with a new, raw honesty. "This is the price my bloodline has paid to give you generations of peace." Lord Morcant sought to use it as a weapon against me. He called my Luna a weakness. You have seen tonight that she is the opposite. She is my strength. She is the only one who can quell the storm inside me. He turned to look down at her, and though she could not see it, everyone else in the courtyard saw the expression on his face. The cold mask of the Monster King was gone, replaced by a look of raw, fierce devotion. "The bonding ceremony was interrupted," he declared, "but the bond is forged. It was forged in blood and shadow. I claim Seraphina as my Luna, my mate, my queen. Let any who would challenge that step forward now." He scanned the crowd, his gaze daring anyone to speak. No one did. They had seen his power, and they had seen her power over him. They were two sides of a coin, a terrifying darkness and a gentle light. Together, they were something new, something no one dared to oppose. He leaned down and whispered in her ear, his voice for her alone. "This changes nothing of our fight. The curse is still a part of me." "I know," she whispered back, her hand finding his. "But you are no longer fighting it alone." As he led her from the courtyard, leaving Gareth to clean up the bloody aftermath, Seraphina knew the turning point had passed. They had confessed their secrets, faced down their enemies, and survived. But the true battle, the one for Alaric's soul, was far from over. The curse was not defeated, merely silenced, and now that it knew her, it would surely see her as its greatest enemy. In the aftermath of the failed coup, a fragile quiet settled over the Dreadfort. The surviving conspirators were dealt with swiftly and justly, their punishment a stark warning against future treason. But the fear they had sown lingered. The court now looked at Alaric with a new kind of terror, and at Seraphina with a bewildered awe. They were no longer just a king and his strange consort. They were a legend in the making. A story of a monster and the maiden who held his leash. Alaric was changed. The public unleashing of his curse, and Seraphina's calming of it, had broken something open in him. He no longer hid his vulnerability from her. He allowed her to see him in his moments of pain, when the shadow writhed beneath his skin, threatening to overwhelm him. He would come to her, his body rigid, and she would take his hands, her touch a balm, her presence a sanctuary. She would listen to the frantic, agonizing beat of his heart until it slowed, until the storm passed. "It is getting worse," he confessed one night, as they sat before the fire in his chambers. He was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, the picture of exhaustion. "Since that night in the courtyard, it feels hungrier, more active, as if tasting freedom made it want more." "It sees me as a threat," Seraphina murmured, her hands tracing the worn embroidery on her sleeve. "Before, it was content in its prison, but now it has an enemy within the walls. It is fighting back." She could feel it too, a subtle shift in the curse's energy. It was more cunning now, its pain sharper, its whispers in his mind more insidious. It was trying to drive a wedge between them, trying to convince him that she was a danger, that her power would eventually destroy him. Their search for answers in the royal library became more desperate. They spent hours poring over ancient texts, Serafina running her sensitive fingers over the brittle pages as Alaric read aloud in his low, rumbling voice. They found fragmented prophecies, cryptic warnings, and tales of shadow pacts, but no clear solution. The texts all speak of balancing the shadow, Alaric said, his frustration evident. They say the king must master it, not destroy it. But none of them explain how. Perhaps mastery is not about control, Serafina suggested, her head tilted as she listened to the subtle truths hidden between the words he read. Perhaps it is about acceptance. He looked at her, his shadowed heart pulsing with confusion. Acceptance? How can I accept this thing that has caused me nothing but agony my entire life? It is a part of you, she said gently. Your ancestor invited it in. You cannot cut off a piece of your own soul. Trying to fight it, to cage it, only makes it stronger, angrier. What if you stopped fighting? The idea was radical, terrifying. All his life, Alaric had been at war with himself. To lay down his arms felt like surrender. It felt like letting the monster win. Before he could argue, a piercing pain shot through his body, so intense it made him cry out and clutch his chest. He doubled over, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Alaric! Serafina was at his side in an instant, her hands on his back. The curse was raging, a chaotic, violent tempest under his skin. It was the worst attack yet. His heartbeat was a frantic, painful slamming against his ribs. It's trying to break free, he choked out, his body convulsing. Black, shadowy tendrils began to seep from his skin, writhing in the air around him. The temperature in the room plummeted. This was it. The final confrontation. The curse was making its move, trying to consume him completely. Serafina knew, with chilling certainty, that her touch alone would not be enough this time. She had to do more than just soothe him. She had to heal him. Don't fight it, she pleaded, her voice urgent. Listen to me, Alaric. Stop fighting. Accept it. Accept all of yourself. The king, the man, and the shadow. They are all you. I can't, he groaned, his control slipping. The monstrous snarl from the courtyard began to bubble in his throat. Yes, you can. She pressed herself against him, her cheek against his back, her arms wrapping around his torso. She ignored the biting cold, the terrifying energy of the shadows that licked at her skin. You are not just the shadow, and you are not just the king. You are both. You are whole. I choose all of you, Alaric. Now you must choose yourself. He had to make the ultimate choice, to continue the futile, centuries-long war against the darkness inside him, or to embrace it as part of himself, trusting in her, in them, to keep it from consuming him. It was an act of supreme surrender and supreme courage. She felt the moment his decision was made. The violent resistance in his muscles ceased. He stopped fighting. He let go. The curse roared, sensing victory. The shadows exploded outwards, engulfing them both in a vortex of freezing darkness. Alaric's body went limp in her arms. His heart stopped. The bell, broken as it was, fell silent. For a terrifying second, there was nothing. But Serafina did not let go. This was her triumph, her purpose. Her unique skill was not just hearing, it was understanding. It was empathy made manifest. It was a form of healing that mended not flesh, but souls. She closed her eyes and focused all of her being on the silent space where his heart should be. She poured her love, her acceptance, her unwavering belief in the good man she knew him to be, into that void. She did not try to fight the shadow. She embraced it, just as she had asked him to. She accepted it as part of the man she loved. And then, a miracle. A new sound began. It was not the broken tolling of the bell. It was a pure, deep, resonant hum, a perfect chord. It was the sound of two things, light and shadow, finally finding harmony, the sound of a soul becoming whole. The freezing darkness receded as quickly as it had come. The shadowy tendrils dissolved into nothing. The air in the room warmed. Alaric stirred in her arms, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He lifted his head, and she felt him turn to look at her. He took her hand and placed it on his chest. And she heard it. For the first time, clear, strong, and whole, she heard the steady, powerful, and unbroken beat of his heart. The curse was not gone. She could still feel its presence, a deep, quiet hum of immense power beneath the rhythm of his heart. But it was no longer a raging monster. It was at peace. It was a part of him, balanced and controlled, a source of strength, not of pain. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief and overwhelming emotion. "Serafina, you healed me." Tears of relief and joy streamed down her face. "No," she corrected him softly. "We healed you." He pulled her into his arms, his embrace no longer tainted by pain, but filled with a profound, unrestrained love. He was whole. He was free. And in healing him, Serafina had found her own true strength, her own place in the world. She was not a broken Omega. She was a healer of souls, a queen of shadows and light. Their bond was no longer just forged in blood and desperation, but in acceptance, love, and a shared victory over an ancient darkness. 1 year later, the Dreadfort was no longer a place of fear and shadow. The heavy tapestries had been pulled back to let in the bright northern sun, and the silent halls often echoed with laughter. King Alaric ruled with a wisdom and compassion that his people had never expected, his fearsome power now tempered by a gentle heart. The stories of the Monster King were replaced with tales of the Shadow King and his Whispering Queen, a ruler who could command the darkness, and the Luna, who could hear the truth of any heart. Serafina stood on the balcony overlooking the snow-dusted gardens, a soft breeze playing with a stray strand of her silver hair. She was no longer the frail, frightened girl who had arrived here as a tribute. She was Luna of the North, a queen respected and loved by her people. Her blindness was seen not as a weakness, but as the source of her incredible insight. Lords and ladies sought her counsel, knowing she could hear the truth beneath their polished words. She had taught the harsh warrior society of the North that there were many kinds of strength, and the greatest of these was empathy. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar, beloved scent of winter storms and pine filled her senses. Alaric rested his chin on her shoulder, his hand coming to rest protectively over her gently swelling belly. "What are you listening to today, my love?" he murmured against her ear. She smiled, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. His heartbeat was a deep, steady rhythm against her back, a constant and reassuring song that was the background music of her life. "I'm listening to the future," she replied softly. She placed her hand over his on her stomach. Beneath her palm, she could feel a tiny, fluttering pulse, a new heartbeat, a new life. It was a perfect, harmonious blend of his deep, resonant tone and her own lighter, quicker rhythm. A song of shadow and light, already in perfect balance. "He has your strength," she whispered. "And your heart," Alaric added, his voice thick with emotion. He turned her in his arms, his hands framing her face. The curse was still a part of him, a quiet power she could always feel, but it was now a tool, not a tormentor. It gave him an unparalleled connection to his lands and his people, and it no longer caused him a whisper of pain. His touch was only warmth, only love. "I never thought this was possible," he said, his voice raw with a gratitude that never seemed to fade. "A life without pain, a family, love. You gave me all of this." "You learned to accept all of yourself, Alaric," she corrected him gently. "I just held the light for you until you could find your way back." He leaned down and kissed her, a tender, lingering kiss filled with the promises of a long and happy life together. The kingdom was at peace, the throne was secure, and their family was growing. The broken Omega and the cursed king had found their healing in each other, transforming not only their own lives, but the very heart of their kingdom. And as the northern sun shone down on them, their shared heartbeat was the strongest, truest sound in the entire world.